This week, Paul and I discuss how everything you require for learning application security is free. In the news, AMD has their own processor vulnerability issues to deal with. Binance takes bounty programs to a whole new level. And Let's Encrypt now supports wildcard certificates. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. IT Pro TV, binge-worthy learning for IT teams. Why is it binge-worthy? It's learning presented in an engaging and entertaining talk show format that beats voice-over PowerPoint snooze fests. Watch over 3,300 hours of content in their on-demand library, on your desktop, on the go, or in the comfort of your own living room. IT Pro TV is IT training you and your team actually want to watch, which means a better return on your learning investment. Get started with IT Pro TV for teams by visiting itpro.tv/Security Weekly and start a 7-day free trial and get 30% off standard or premium IT Pro TV memberships using the code SECWeekly30.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 9, our 10th episode of Application Security Weekly. I am, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to once again be joined by my illustrious co-host, Paul Asadori.
Welcome, everyone. It's nice to be on Application Security Weekly. Always excited for all of the happenings here on this show. Keith, we got a couple of announcements before we get started. Let's get through them.
Yeah, go ahead. Jump into the first two, Paul.
So a couple more conference announcements. Source Boston, the 10th annual Source Boston conference will be held from May 9th through the 10th in Boston. SW75 WMKW is the $75 off discount code for that show. Next week will be at InfoSec World. It's almost kind of too late to make those announcements. Like, if you're not going by now, you're probably not going. So then after that, there is B-Sides Orlando, April 7th. Link for that's in the show notes. And the Social Engineering Rhode Island Conference on June 16th in Newport, Rhode Island, se-ri.org. Patrick Laverty was in studio last night talking about social engineering and this conference. So all good stuff. Awesome. I'll be speaking at 2 out of those 3. I'll be speaking at Source, and I'll be speaking at the SERI conference. So,
and the SERI conference is going to be really cool because I actually know both of the organizers. In fact, Patrick, I used to work with at Rapid7, and I was working pretty closely with him at B-Sides Boston. And then Lee Snyder, who also was an organizer and chairperson of B-Sides Boston, is helping to organize that conference as well. So I think I'll probably be roped into volunteering. I know I've been asked and committed to that. So at this point, sweet. I'm pretty much guaranteed to be there.
Yeah, that's awesome. And so B-Sides Boston this year, is that a different team running it, Keith?
It is. So it's a lot of the same organizers that have done this in the past. So I'm actually more of an advisor to B-Sides Boston at this point, but it is going to be in the fall, as far as I understand, just because of some of the chaos of conferences changing over from timeframes here, especially RSA coming up. So to that end, they decided to move it into the fall, so it would be a little bit easier for everyone involved. Couple other quick announcements as well, unless we want to save those for the next segment, Paul.
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay, sounds good. So a couple of things that I just wanted to cover for this week is that we're actually going to be talking about our talks at InfoSec World coming up. I figured this might be a great opportunity, Paul, for you to dive into a little bit of the stuff that you've been working on for your talk. Of course, you don't want to give it all away because you're going to be speaking about it on Monday. But then also talk maybe a little bit about the application security side of things that I'm working on for my talk as well. So, Paul, what is the title of your talk again? And to that end, how's it going?
I'm behind on slide stuff, in case you're wondering, which really stressed me out. But the talk is almost done. It's almost done. The best things in enterprise security are free sometimes. So, I mean, basically, I'm going to walk people through kind of the progression of open source in our industry and as it relates to the enterprise. I'm going to talk about how most open source deployments usually go. And by deployments, I mean like when you're testing out open source software the first time or trying to solve a problem with open source software, some of the issues and challenges that are associated with that. And I've got the really funny graphs and stuff to talk about that. Then why you shouldn't use open source software in the enterprise, all the arguments as to why you shouldn't use it, and then why you should use it in the enterprise, and then some examples of some really good open source security software, which I think for me, a few things emerged, and I didn't have a chance to test every open source security software out there, obviously, but there's some cool like tools that you can integrate. The Security Onion, it really impressed me as being one of the most mature and put together projects for the enterprise in open source for defense. It seems to be the de facto standard. There isn't a similar distribution that I will mention that I discovered. It came out of like some National Guard in Missouri or something like that. There's probably people screaming at me what that is. I don't know if you know what that one is. There's a similar one to Security Onion. Basically takes Snort and Suricata and pieces them together and has an elk stack and all that stuff. So you got a couple of options there. Security Onion is the one that I tested and actually implemented here in the studio. And I was super impressed. I mean, having done that level of analysis for a lot of larger organizations, I was impressed as to how that project came along. There's also some really cool like endpoint things. So Facebook has Collide, which is an interface and system for OS Query. I'll talk about that briefly. Again, that's not something I was able to test in depth. Graylog was another one that I hadn't heard of that I think is pretty similar. So basically, one of the questions I was posing in research I did was there's 50 endpoint companies at least. But what does open source have to offer? Like, what can you accomplish? And so I'll talk about some of the options that you have there on the open source side.
So with Security Onion specifically, that's kind of like the Defender's version of Kali Linux, right? Like, is that probably the best way to compare it?
Sure.
To the bundling of defensive tools?
Yeah. So it includes Bro. You choose either Snort or Suricata. I'm using Snort now. All the interfaces for Snort are pre-configured, so Squeal works right out of the box. Squirt works right out of the box. Then the experimental version that I'm using is really awesome because it has an elk stack. And the elk stack is automatically configured to look at your syslogs. And I'm not sending a bunch of syslog to it, but I am going to do that. And it's looking at your bro logs. So you're able to use the Kibana interface with all the pretty graphs to look at your bro logs and all of your connections in different traffic. So, and then of course you can put the open source Rita software from our company, Active Countermeasures, that installs right on. I think there's some issues now installing Rita on the experimental version, and the developers are working on syncing it up. So I'll try and include some screenshots, but I didn't get a chance to play with it just because like you need a beta version of Rita and the experimental version of Security Onion, and we just, developers just need some more time to work on that. But that will be coming, and it's pretty easy to install. Again, it's just some debugging that has to happen to make those two projects meld together. If you're running the stable version, it works fine. So stable version Rita, stable version of Security Onion, Rita installs like right from the documentation, and it works. So I'm confident that once the beta and experimental versions become the stable version, it'll be fine.
So with Security Onion, I guess my only question for it is this like the sort of thing you put somewhere in like a central location on a server inside of your network to grab everything from? So it's almost like a syslog server where you can then have all the tooling built into it directly?
Yeah. So if you want to get crazy with it, and this is really what was interesting to me, is that you can run it in just like experimental mode and just run one box and have it run everything. There's also extensive documentation on deploying sensors and creating Security Onion sensors and analyst VMs and the central engine. So you can like break out this architecture and spread it out throughout your environment. I know a lot of enterprises I spoke with are using Bro. I think many of those are also using the Security Onion as that platform to get Snort and Bro out in their environment without having to spend all that time. Like I remember years ago trying to compile Snort, and it's just like,
and they got all the rules in place.
The level of effort to get all that stuff working today is just unbelievable. I used to be able to just compile Snort. Yeah, maybe I had some issues, some dependency things, and I'd fix them. Now I'm just going to get the Security Onion because it's just, they've spent the time to make it work in their platform. So,
is it built to be well managed within like a cloud environment. So if they're actually trying to put it into like AWS or anything like that, do they have, because I know they have like AMIs that you can actually grab for certain software applications or even sets of software applications in Amazon or Google or what have you. Is it built to run on or in a cloud environment?
It's a good question. I'm not sure. I didn't look at running it on. There is a question on their GitHub, and they do have like Doug Burks did respond and point them to some documentation. I'm kind of reading as we go.
Sure. I mean, I wouldn't be surprised, honestly, if they decided to put together some AMIs that people could just spin up inside of their VPC, for example. I mean, being that it's effectively just loading that virtual machine into the environment accordingly, I'm sure someone has built either Chef or Puppet or Ansible scripts to do the detector or the agent deployments or the sensor deployments inside of cloud environments. Because at the end of the day, that's where most organizations are moving to. And so I would imagine that Bro and the rest of the tools that are being offered inside of Security Onion are really good for syslog grabbing inside of your network for traditional security issues, but then those newfangled issues for DevOps, where everything is getting pushed into that cloud environment, being able to quickly leverage the same sort of tool sets out in the cloud, or even if it's just deploy sensors there that connect back to a local server instance, would actually be really, really sweet.
Yeah, and they definitely use Docker inside of it too. I'm not sure if you can do the full deployment using Docker. But certainly when you spin up the VM, it is using Docker kind of under the covers. He does have a registry available where you can go pull, those Docker images. I'm not sure how far along they are with that. Probably a good idea to bring Doug on the show and talk about it. Because like I said, I was pretty impressed. Most people that responded to my Twitter question, were using the Security Onion somewhere in their architecture. It definitely was one of the most popular ones that came up. So
Gotcha.
It's interesting. With all the tools you have available today for monitoring your network, the open source one's pretty damn good today. So that was my impression.
And like our good friend and friend of the show, Apollo Clark, would probably point out the many things that you can do with Elk stacks today, which are all effectively free for you to be able to spin up and run. So it sounds like those, for the most part, Security Onion is focusing on perhaps incident detection and response, maybe a bit of the security incident event management space. Is there anything else that it also covers in terms of either some of the like free web application firewalls or even dynamic application scanning tools or anything like that it bundles in as well?
No, it's really just all about network monitoring and log monitoring.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I don't even think
that end,
like Nmap wasn't installed by default or anything like that. I think it's just about monitoring.
And to that end, I mean, it's one of those kind of fundamental things that all companies need to do at some point. And so if it doesn't have things like mod security built in, that's not a huge issue per se, because it's not intended to block and tackle. It's intended to enable the security operations center to detect and respond. So it sounds like there's opportunities there for someone to build out maybe like a application security defense-based or defense-focused tooling that can scan some of your applications, but in addition to that, put up things like the firewalling, et cetera, as well.
Yeah, and I'd be curious, like what you get from the logs. Like if you were to send your web server logs to it, some of the analysis that could happen there. Also, I've got a project that I want to start. Which really, it's not really security related, but I'm wondering if I can use the same architecture because Kibana gives you those awesome graphs and stuff. I want to query the systems that we have here in production for running the show for performance and like health monitoring. So
yeah,
I want CPU temperature because we've got some cooling issues that we're working on, and that tends to kill some of those systems in production that we physically have to have here. Believe me, I'd love to have everything in the cloud or virtual, but when you have physical hardware plugged into all those systems, I want to be able to monitor those systems for things like high CPU spikes, high memory usage, and basically the heat. I mean, those are three things that I've kind of theorized. Like maybe I can use something like OS Query or some type of open source agent to collect that information from the operating system, send it into the the Elk stack on Security Onion, maybe build some graphs out. Or if there are other solutions that will, just help me do that. Maybe Collide can provide that, but that seems more like a query language. But you can save queries. So I'm wondering if I put the OS query stuff in my environment, if I can query that to have pre-built queries to say, okay, give me the CPU temperature, and graph it over the past 24 hours or whatever.
And to that end, I mean, there are ways that I know you can do that same sort of work in things like Splunk. So clearly the logs are able to be aggregated in a way that is easy to do. And so it's just a matter of putting together that data in a way that makes sense for you and then displaying it in a dashboard accordingly. So it sounds like it should be doable, especially if you just kind of run it as maybe some repeated bash scripts that run on a regular basis or that are kicking off as part of your current scripting. So for example, when you kick off ppworks, which is the post-production works script written in Python, maybe also have it then as part of that call up a script to run during the execution of ppworks to actually like check and monitor for those things accordingly, which to that end, I mean, parts of security that are important is performance, right? Like
Absolutely.
Denial of service is a very real problem or a potential problem.
Absolutely.
You were going to say something though, Paul.
I don't know what I was going to say. I'm still burnt out from the past couple of days. I spent a lot of time with talking with vendors and stuff, so my brain's pretty fried today.
I'm surprised you're not, playing buzzword bingo today. We can just like throw them all out there from all the things that you heard. Did you end up using that, what the F is my security strategy thing at all when you were at the conferences?
No, I didn't. We need to get there. There was a lot of buzzwords, but most companies now are kind of onto the whole machine learning and AI because they all use it, and it's not a differentiator anymore.
Right.
And so most when they talk about it, they're like, yeah, we have that, but it does like this cool. So they're furthering trying to differentiate themselves because I think people got too savvy today to be like, yeah, everyone's doing machine learning and AI, or at least they're claiming to. So stop just throwing that term out there. You don't really know what it means.
Well, when they add blockchain to it, it starts to add valuation to their company.
Yes.
So to that end, that's like the new thing. So for my end at InfoSec World, I'm talking actually about how to teach yourself application security. And effectively, I go through a lot of the points in that as well that are intended to teach you how to do it for free, right? That's part of why, like as part of my setup, I go through a few different things. So I talk a little bit about the concept of attack-driven development, which is effectively, if you want to really learn a language, a framework, or a library, the best way to learn where it's vulnerable is to actually build vulnerable applications. And then the best way to teach yourself how to actually attack vulnerable applications is to then attack your vulnerable applications. And then it goes through a process of remediation or fixing or refactoring is kind of the right term I like to think of how would a developer actually make this more secure? Maybe not like totally ironclad. So if I'm doing SQL queries, maybe don't use the ORM, for example. And then continue that process of build, break, fix until eventually, as a developer or as a security professional, you've learned a new language or framework, you know where it's vulnerable or how it could fall down, and you know how to fix it or actually how to make it more secure. So that's the crux of my talk effectively. But one of the things, and I think that we're probably going to do a whole podcast on this at some point, is I talk about the importance of building a lab that you enjoy working in. And a lot of those tools, believe it or not, are free, which is kind of nice. Paul, I know that I suggested VS Code, I think either last week or the week before, as like the editor / IDE that I really enjoy working in. And to that end, I know that we were talking about suggesting that you use it in the environment there for development. Have you had a chance to check out VS Code at all?
I have not. Don't
worry about it. You will eventually.
I've been really busy building the deck for this next presentation, which requires a lot of research, which still isn't done. So
understood. And actually, it's funny because for the deck that I've built for this talk for attack-driven development, it's all written in Impress.js, which is a Prezi replacement that uses HTML and JavaScript and some CSS to effectively give your presentation.
I hate Prezi. Most people know that.
Right. Well, so
some bad experiences.
It's funny because
it's a long story.
It's one of those tools that it's cool like on the face of it, but it is still somewhat limiting. And so when you get into Impress.js, it's like, yeah, not only can I do all the things that Prezi does, but I can do anything that HTML5 or JavaScript can do. So the ideas or concepts around 3-dimensional presentations, it actually becomes like a reality. I can go deep, or I can go like, take 10 steps back and take a look at it from a 10,000 foot overview. So yeah, effectively, when people come to my talk, they'll get an opportunity to see what more or less looks like I'm writing code in an editor as my talk. So I look forward to getting the reactions from the crowd on that, because I know that when Mark, our good friend Mark, who's also one of the organizers, saw this at DevSecCon Boston last year, he was like, "Yep, need to see some of that." So that was kind of how I ended up even being accepted to InfoSec World, which was kind of nice.
It's awesome.
But yeah, so I go through a number of open source tools as well in there. So of course, OWASP Zap, and I definitely recommend it for those that are using Burp Suite. Take a second look at it. And the reason I say that is because you can automate things by building your own scripts for it. And in the number of other tools that I go into as like thoughts, recommendations, feedback, how to set up your lab locally, considerations for setting it up in the cloud, and all that fun stuff. So yeah, I'm speaking Tuesday night actually. So we'll get to see your talk on Monday, and then you'll get to hopefully maybe get a chance to come to mine on Tuesday night.
Awesome.
So just a couple of things in the learning and tools this week, which are actually all tools related. And I just wanted to highlight them before we jump into the news. So Uber just released an open source adversarial simulation tool called Meta. And so effectively what it's intending to do is to allow companies to test the resiliency of their security posture. So maybe, pop open Security Onion and collect those logs first, or get set up to collect those logs, and then go pop open Meta to do adversarial simulation. So to see what effectively a red team engagement would feel like from the perspective of Uber's open source tool. To that end, you can see if you actually are picking up all the logs and addressing problems that you might otherwise not know you have. So I thought that this was a cool tool to check out. Paul, did you happen to hear about this at all? I know it made a little bit of a splash this week, but not nearly as much as some of the news items we're going to talk about later.
I have, and this is a really hot topic and category in our industry today. There's, of course, a whole bunch of commercial vendors that are offering this attack simulation, as they call it. There's a couple of open source efforts, Atomic Red Team by Red Canary. There's another one that came from MITRE itself, and John and Joff did a tech segment on the show. I can't remember that name. And then John is the one that told me about. Chris Gates is the one that wrote this. He works for Uber and is releasing it, open source. So we'll definitely talk about a little bit about that in my talk as well. I probably need to dump this tool in there as well into my talk, as well as some of the other open source options for that. So.
Yeah, and I think the MITRE tool is it's called Attack, but it's ATT ampersand CK. I can't remember the
MITRE has the MITRE Attack framework, but they also put together a kind of an early beta tool that kind of automates some of the attacks in there. And Joff and John got that working. And hold on, I got to pull it up now. Hold on. I can't think of the name.
That's okay.
I don't remember what show that was.
Make sure we highlight it.
Either. Hold on. I'll find it. Keep talking. I'll find it.
Sure. So the other one, while we're looking into the attack simulation tool that Joff and John were talking about on a previous show on Pulse Security Weekly, the other one that I wanted to highlight was the Probable Word Lists project, which takes a lot of the work that Daniel Miessler and my manager Jason Haddix have done for collecting and aggregating various sec lists, word lists for directory brute forcing, or for subdomain brute forcing, and so on and so forth. And they've collected it and aggregated it based on probability. So taking statistical methods to look at word lists that are more effective than others, and aggregating and putting those word lists in order in a way that makes sense from a testing perspective.
Oh, so it's called Caldera.
Yes. Okay, I do remember that now. And we'll probably have to do like a whole show on. At this point, I feel like we're going to have to do a whole show on open source tools for security professionals, because there are a lot, both on the defense and the offensive side, including the last one that I actually mentioned here in the show notes, which is Attack Deploy. So it's another tool that has recently been Dockerized and included in the Docker Attack set of tools by Zephyrfish, or that Zephyrfish has put together on GitHub.
Yeah. So I hadn't heard of Zephyrfish's Attack Deploy. What is that?
So it's a attack server deployment that basically sets up so you can put into an environment, my understanding of a set of tools for then furthering your attack chain inside of an environment. So kind of like, okay, if I was on a footprint on a server, could I drop Kali Linux. Well, why would I drop a huge Kali Linux box when I could drop attack deploy and continue to move laterally or deepen my attack surface within the organization itself? So yeah, I thought that this was a cool tool to have Dockerized because with Windows Server 2016, Docker is actually installed on there by default. So you now have the ability to go ahead and just basically drop tool sets into environments for attack purposes. So it includes things like GoBuster, Hashcat, Hydra, Nmap, SQL Map, and so on. So kind of a cool lightweight attack tool to effectively throw your tool sets into an environment that you're currently compromising for a pen test perspective.
And you know, I think that pen testers should be looking at this technology, not just for internally creating your tool set, but maybe internally and externally, so that when you go to do an assessment, you need a bunch of stuff, right? You need a bunch of software, you need a bunch of listeners, you need a bunch of things that maybe capture and send stuff up to the listeners. And that environment gets built and torn down every time you do a test, right? And so Docker, to me, is a perfect technology to do this. And I'm not surprised just to see projects start moving in that direction to essentially allow you to use Docker to quickly and easily deploy all your pen test tools, do the test, and then tear them down.
For sure. And to the extent that I know that Jesse Frizzell, who now works at Microsoft and has formerly done some development on both Docker and Kubernetes, and who I hope to eventually get on the show, has actually shown that you can take Docker and not only leverage it for command line based tooling, but you can do like X forwarding of everything that's being displayed in the Docker container out to your native environment. So she did, I think, like Skype, I'm trying to remember, Spotify, Hangouts, Chrome. Like she did a ton of different tools as a couple of different talks she put up on YouTube, or they might still be on YouTube. I don't know if they've since been removed, because that was, I think, 2015 that she was doing this. But yeah, to the extent that you no longer need a monolithic VM to do all of your attack tooling is a very real future that's coming very quickly.
It's awesome.
With that, we're going to go ahead and take a break, and then we'll come back for a few announcements and the news.